Hello, welcome to Intro to Soc. This week we're going to be talking about gender and sexuality. So this is the agenda for this week. We're going to talk about introducing gender, what does it mean? Next we're going to move on to what's the difference between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. We're going to talk about gender socialization, why does gender exist? Talk about the phenomenon of gender typing and how that kind of relates to the wage gap, as well as talk a little bit about sexuality and about specific current issues that are happening in sociology that researchers are really interested in right now. So we'll start off. So what is gender? Gender is a lot more complicated than it seems. The definition of gender has kind of changed and expanded over time. So it used to be that gender and sex were just exactly the same thing. There was no difference. We've kind of started to realize that it is more complicated than that, so they're not necessarily synonymous. Gender goes beyond sex, as we recognize now, and captures how we understand masculinity and femininity. So we're seeing gender as more of an expression of being, an expression of identity that goes beyond just biological sex. So for sociologists, we view gender as distinct from biological sex and sexual orientation. So sex is biology. It's what you've got down there, up there. Gender is about behavior. It's about what you do. And gender and sex are closely related. So how we behave depends on how we were categorized at birth via our sex. And sexual orientation is a little bit different than both of those. Sexual orientation is about who we're interested in sexually, who we're interested in romantically. So it's romantic, emotional, and sexual attraction. So sociologists recognize these three issues as totally distinct things. Gender is basically just another dimension of human identity. So it kind of shapes how we behave around other people. It shapes who we become, some of the careers that we might be interested in, some of our goals for the future, and how we experience the world. So we'll talk a little bit more about sex. We're going to start breaking these down so we understand the difference between these three issues. So sex obviously has to do with the biological genitalia and chromosome composition that you have at birth. Sex is both biologically real and socially constructed. So the biological differences do exist. We can't deny that. There are differences that we visibly see. But we as a society have kind of decided how to categorize people according to these differences. So these differences have always existed, but we haven't always had a term for the differences. So we didn't always know that they were men versus women. That's something that we had to come up with on our own. Hopefully you can kind of remember back to the social construction of reality. There is nothing that is meaningful or valuable unless we as people and as a society start to attribute meaning and value to something. So it had to come from somewhere, so in that case, it's both real and socially constructed. So the sex labels, meaning male, female, and intersex, we'll talk a little bit about intersex and what that means. These labels kind of help us to organize our social world. Again, we like things to make sense. So by knowing that people are considered men, women, or intersex at this very basic level of sex, that kind of helps us to make sense of things. So there is something called intersex. I'm not sure if you have ever heard of it, but we'll talk about it and see what that means. So it's often called the third sex. So basically what happens is that some people are born with both male and female biological traits. So this is not the same thing as transgender. This is totally different. This is a distinct phenomenon. Transgender individuals, while some of them may go through transitionary surgeries to make them have the appearance of the sex that they believe they are, they're born this way. So a person who is intersex may have the appearance of a vagina that you can see, but kind of up higher in their bodies, they may have a set of testes. So this isn't something that they changed. This is something that they're born with. So you can't usually tell when a person is intersex because they usually appear wholly male or wholly female on the outside. Unfortunately, intersex people are often subjected to very invasive early surgeries to correct what people perceive as being a problem. So they don't really get a say in whether or not they have these testes or ovaries or whatever it is that they have that's considered quote unquote extra removed. That's not left up to them. So it kind of leaves them with feelings of shame and confusion and isolation. Sometimes they're lied to about what surgery took place. They're not always told the truth. And some of them may grow up to learn they have infertility issues and just were never told that they were born an intersex individual. So that can leave them feeling angry, with their parents and the doctors who didn't tell them truthfully what was going on with them and didn't let them make any decisions for themselves. So intersex people, you may have heard this term, they used to be called hermaphrodites. However, this term is now considered pretty outdated and derogatory now that we can better understand what this medical condition looks like. So we don't call it that anymore. However, you may have heard it explained that way before. So next we'll move on to what is gender. So again, gender is about behavior. It's the behaviors, characteristics, and traits that we associate with being male or female. That's how it's related to sex, but slightly different. So gender behaviors include how we talk, how we dress, feel. It can maybe help us shape what we want out of life. It can help us form future goals. It shapes what we decide to do for fun, so how we play, and maybe what we want to do for a job. Our assumptions about gender can tell us about what people are interested in, good at, or capable of, but we know that this sometimes runs us into trouble. We don't always make the correct assumptions. So for gender, it's not about what you got in terms of biological or physical attributes. It's about what you do. It's about how you behave and interact with other people. Importantly, recognizing that gender exists in terms of behavior doesn't mean that we are denying the reality of biological sex. Again, it's real. We can't deny it, but gender does help us to understand how sex influences our development and experiences more broadly. So try not to think of it so much as a replacement of sex, but consider it more of an expansion. Now that we've gotten new knowledge about people and how they interact and how they are shaped and socialized, we can have these two things that exist, but yet they're pretty distinct but still connected. So it's not a replacement. So sex differences themselves aren't really bad. That's okay. It only becomes bad when people are treated unequally or badly because of their difference. So obviously, difference between people is not an excuse for mistreatment. So let's talk a little bit about gender socialization. Hopefully you can remember the socialization chapter we went over a few weeks ago. So we call gender socialization gender roles. Hopefully you can also remember when we talked about social roles. So these are the behaviors that we're expected to do kind of based on our position in society. And your gender is a form of position in society. So learning gender roles are expectations about how a person will or should behave based on the traits that we associate with their biological sex. So basically when we learn gender roles, we're learning what it means to be masculine or feminine through the process of socialization. We don't come out of the womb knowing how to be a man or how to be a woman, just like we don't come out of the womb knowing what's right, what's meaningful, or what's true. That's something that we have to learn from other people and learn through socialization. So like everything else, we learn about gender roles from 4 primary agents of socialization. These are going to be the parents, of course. We learn it from school, we learn it from peers, as well as the media. So sociologists contend that masculine and feminine behavior are, excuse me, I messed that up. Sociologists contend that masculine and feminine are ways to describe behavior and traits that we pursue early on. So we don't necessarily say that somebody is masculine or is feminine, but we try to more allude that the behaviors that they're doing are masculine behaviors or feminine behaviors. There's really no clear definition of masculinity and femininity because it all kind of happens on a spectrum. What's masculine to somebody might not be masculine to somebody else, or what's feminine to somebody may be totally different for somebody else. So it's all kind of subjective. Despite this, that it happens on a spectrum, most societies do have somewhat of an ideal type of man or woman in mind. And again, we often depict this in movies. So the ideal type is often pretty difficult to achieve. So most people can't be Arnold Schwarzenegger, can't really display that level of masculinity because the human experience is way too complex for that. Most people have both masculine and feminine traits. So just being a man doesn't mean that you don't have any feminine traits, or just being a woman doesn't mean that you don't ever have masculine traits. You can have both at the same time. So it's different to only, it's difficult to really have only one or the other. Most of us have a mixture of both. And then, of course, perceptions of masculinity and femininity vary by culture and over time. So just as an overview, when we're talking about sociology specifically, this is how we're thinking of gender. So masculine and feminine describe behavior. There's more than one way to be masculine or feminine. It happens on a spectrum, though there are ideal types that most of us can't really achieve due to to the complexity of the rest of our identities. Gender isn't all or nothing, so we all display some level of masculinity or femininity. It's not all or nothing. And perceptions of femininity and masculinity do vary by culture, and they're likely to change over time. So maybe what your grandparents thought was masculine isn't what we perceive as masculine now. Or what we perceive as masculine here in the US isn't how they perceive masculinity in Japan. So it all really varies and is all pretty subjective, though there are some patterns and trends. So here's an example of how gender has changed over time. So historically, it used to be a sign of peak masculinity for men to wear high heels. High heels weren't just made for women. They were made for men to make them appear taller, to appear physically fit and skilled in horseback riding and combat. Another example is that some of the most revered male opera singers in the world, also called the castrati, were men who had been castrated to sing high notes, since women weren't actually allowed to sing in church choirs at that time. They weren't allowed in king's courts, so they had to have somebody there to be the soprano or alto voices. So men would take over those roles. This all happened before the late 1800s. So let's talk about why gender exists and how it persists. So again, our assumptions about gender help us to make order and make sense out of our social world. It can tell us kind of what to expect from people. It can help us make somewhat accurate guesses about what people like to do. We can make assumptions about what people care about based on their gender. We can try to come up with ideas about maybe what their strengths and abilities might be. But of course, these assumptions can be really wrong. People are way too complex to be fit into little boxes of identity. So these wrong assumptions can actually be pretty harmful because sometimes it shuts off opportunities for men to do something that's traditionally viewed as feminine and vice versa. So for example, we might assume that women want to have children. That's actually not true for everyone. Some women don't want to have children at all, and if a woman can't have children due to medical issues, it can be really harmful if we're always asking them those questions. We might assume that women just like shopping and makeup. Not all women like that. We can assume that women aren't interested in having platonic relationships with men, that they're only interested in romantic ones. That's not necessarily true either. We'll talk a little bit about women and street harassment. So sometimes people make incorrect assumptions that women like to be complimented by strangers or that they like being whistled out on the street. That's not always true. And we can also make assumptions about men that are incorrect. So not all men like sports. Not all men are super interested in having a high profile career. Maybe they would rather be a stay-at-home dad. Maybe they have other goals that aren't so intense. We can't assume that men don't feel emotions like sadness and fear. They're not always, all full bravado. They have the same range of emotions as women, even though they might express them a little bit differently. And we can't assume that men are only interested in pursuing sexual relationships with women. They might be interested in just friendship too. Or if they just want to hang out, they just want to hang out. They truly want to Netflix and chill. They're not always DTF. So these are some of the assumptions that we make, and they can often be wrong, and obviously that can go pretty badly. So next we're going to talk a little bit about gender typing and what that means. So what is gender typing? Well, it happens when we make these assumptions that men and women end up in certain types of social roles or occupations just because they're meant to be there. That's where they naturally ended up. That's just based on their natural interests and abilities. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Unfortunately, women are more likely to end up in low-level jobs. By low level, I mean jobs with low pay, temporary work. jobs that aren't very prestigious, jobs that don't have a lot of opportunity for promotions. And this isn't necessarily because women want these types of jobs. Instead, they're often passed up for these jobs as a result of their incorrect gender assumptions made about them. These assumptions include that women will leave the job for marriage or children. Maybe they don't want either, and they actually just want to stay in the job and create a high profile career. There's assumptions that women will be the primary caregiver for children and are likely to be called away to pick kids up from school or to tend to them when they are sick. So when school knows that there's a two-parent household, they're more likely to call the mom first, and that might be wrong. I mean, what if the dad is a stay-at-home dad and the mom's working? So we can't really make these assumptions. Women are also assumed that they are only taking a job as supplementary income to support their families rather than seeking to build a long-term career or as being the sole provider. Um, in other words, women are often viewed as disposable labor. You know, they're just kind of here and then they're gone. They're not looking to make a long-term impact, not looking for a high-profile career. So that's a way that companies can kind of justify keeping women in these low-paying and not very prestigious jobs. So when we talk about the gender wage gap, this is one way that that can be explained. So women do make a lot less money than men for some of these reasons, because they're passed off for jobs because of the assumptions made about them, about their capabilities, about what they want out of life. So this is one way that it can be pretty harmful. So it goes both ways. It's not just about making assumptions about women. These assumptions don't only hurt women, they can also be harmful to men. Um, so so men might also experience the effects of gender typing. Based on these incorrect assumptions about men and masculinity, people can often assume that men can't be the victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking by either men or women. This is really unfortunate and very dangerous. Um, a lot of domestic violence shelters aren't equipped to keep men in there, so then they don't have anywhere to go. So we need to start expanding services to make sure that it's being inclusive to men and women. People might also assume that men are interested in or capable of being primary caregivers for children. This is shown by women that are often granted full custody of children over men in divorce proceedings. This is one specific area where women often do trump men in terms of rights. Women are more likely to be granted that full custody based on the assumption that they're more capable or more interested. Schools often assume that that the mom should be called if a child is sick instead of the man, but what if the man is the primary caregiver? So many stay-at-home parent organizations are not really well suited to address the unique needs of stay-at-home dads. So that's something that also needs to change over time. Also, when people are looking for babysitters, they primarily look for women when men might be also equally suited for the job. We also assume that men can't be non-straight and masculine at the same time. Again, masculinity happens on a spectrum. There's no one particular form. So people automatically associate gayness with femininity. We expect gay men to dress or talk in a certain way. We assume that gay men don't want platonic relationships with other men. Obviously, this isn't true. We're really kind of reducing people into a box that way. So just try to think of it in terms of a spectrum. There are no blacks and whites is when it comes to talking about gender as well as other topics in sociology. So in this next section, since we're covering inequalities, inequalities is a really big topic online and in the media right now. So I kind of want to start to address some of these trends and buzzwords that people are using because I often don't feel like they're used properly or they're not contextualized. So I want to make sure that I'm doing right by you by going through these and giving you my perspective based on sociological knowledge and how we're approaching the problem so that you're hearing it from an academic source. So today we're going to be talking about toxic masculinity, and I can already feel some people clenching up, the hair standing up on the back of their neck, but I promise I'm going to go through this and hopefully you can kind of see the method to my madness here. So what is toxic masculinity? Well, again, it's a really, really popular buzzword that you've probably heard about or have seen discussed or mentioned in the media. Unfortunately, this term has been used out of context. Again, people aren't really explaining what they really mean by that. They're just kind of term dropping, just dropping the mic and walking away and not being very critical in how they're using that term. So we're going to talk about what it means to sociologists. And because this term has been used out of context, its true meaning is often misconstructed and misunderstood. And the way that it's used often makes it seem as though it's wrong to be masculine or that men are inherently violent or bad. And this isn't true at all. So stick with me and we'll break this down. So what does toxic masculinity really mean? So at its core, toxic masculinity only applies to the behaviors of some men, not all. Actually, most men don't necessarily engage in toxic masculine behavior. Toxic masculinity happens when some men use their skewed perceptions of masculinity and what it means to be a man to do things like justify violence against women and children. They may do this by claiming that they deserve respect and therefore violence is a way to solve that and to reassert their dominance within the home. They may try to use masculinity to justify using homophobic slurs and bullying other people. They assume that being a man requires denouncing femininity or putting gay men down. So instead of like embracing that they have both masculinity and femininity and that this exists on a spectrum, they're totally denouncing it and denouncing other people who don't fit their idea of what it means to be masculine, particularly gay men. They also may justify engaging in extreme acts of violence. This here is the Aurora, Colorado shooter. So this applies to mass shooters, mass bombers. So they use toxic masculinity as a way to get attention and as a way to kind of show that they've got nerve, they got gusto, that they're not going to be walked all over by whoever they think has offended them. So here's a good example. So Elliot Rogers, you might remember him from that incel video that we watched for the midterm jumbo worksheet. Hopefully, Elliot Rogers is a really good example of a person who expressed toxic masculinity when he claimed that to be a man and to reclaim the masculinity that he perceived as being taken from him, that he needed to kill the women and men who rejected his sexual advances and kill the men who he believed were getting the women's attentions over him. Most men don't think this way. There are plenty of really good men who don't use their masculinity as an excuse for violence or as an excuse to exert control over women who reject them. This is a good example of toxic masculinity. Again, only some men demonstrate this behavior, not all. So what does toxic masculinity not mean? So toxic masculinity does not describe masculinity itself. Instead, it describes a very violent and specific idea of what it means to be a man that some men use to justify their use of violence against other people. So essentially, they're hiding behind masculinity to justify their actions. Toxic masculinity doesn't mean that masculinity itself is bad. It's totally fine to be a man. It's great. We need all the diversity that we can get. There's nothing wrong with being a man or exhibiting masculine behaviors. Both men and women do it. Toxic masculinity also does not mean that men are inherently violent. You can be masculine and not be violent. Violence isn't a necessary aspect of masculinity. It's just a part of a one type. Also, toxic masculinity does not excuse the violent and abusive behavior that some women use. So men and women can both be perpetrators and victims of violent crime. This is just describing a very specific phenomenon. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit more sense of that buzzword and why you're kind of hearing it right now and puts it into some context. Again, I'm going to say this multiple times as we're starting to cover inequalities and as we get into race as well next week. I don't see it as my job to change your mind about ideas, but I do see it as my job to do what I can to make some of these concepts more clear. I'm not asking you to accept them. I'm not asking you to think they're correct. I'm just asking you to give me a listen. And that way you can say that you've kind of heard all sides. So just keep that in mind as we're going through it. So next we're going to talk a little bit about sexuality as well as current issues in sociology that are confronting issues of gender and sexuality most often together. So we're going to talk about what sexual orientation is, how is it different than basic sex and gender. We're going to talk about how we talk about sex. How does the discourse and the dialogue that we use to talk about sex show sociological gendered patterns? And then, of course, we're going to start covering some specific issues. I wish that I could cover these issues in more detail, but I'm certain that you can get more information on this just doing research on your own or taking some other classes in sociology. But I just wanted to be able to dip into just a few that I think might interest you so you can kind of put your finger to the pulse of what we are looking at currently. So first, what's sexual orientation? Sexual orientation is distinct from both sex and gender, though of course they are interrelated. So sexual orientation refers to who you're attracted to. Sociologists perceive sexual orientation as fluid and subject to change. This may change based on a variety of reasons. So people may adjust their sexual orientation after being exposed to new people. I mean, sometimes you just don't know what you like until you're confronted with it. They may change based on exposure to more accepting environments. So maybe if they come from a household which wouldn't accept them, even though they know like deep down that they are gay or lesbian or something along that spectrum. Maybe they go to a place and they start to feel more accepted and like they can express that and actually engage in relationships with other people that they wouldn't have felt comfortable doing back home. So that can change too. As well as just personal growth and discovery. So some people will assume that they have to be straight, which isn't necessarily true. Um, so they're getting exposed to new people, exposed to new places, exposed to new ideas, and that's causing some element of personal growth for them to realize and recognize their sexual orientation and its fluidity. Attraction also has multiple dimensions. So attraction can be sexual, emotional, or romantic. These types of attractions don't necessarily have to coexist. So you can have a sexual connections with somebody without having an emotional connection and vice versa. Some people have a clear understanding of their sexual orientation from the get-go, and other people need just some more time for self-discovery. This is especially true if they don't come from a supportive environment at home or feel ashamed or outcast for their feelings. So it just kind of depends on the person and their context and their environment. So let's talk about how we talk about sex, about the dialogue that surrounds it. So if we pay attention to, we might notice that some of the slang terms that we use to refer to sex are actually a little bit aggressive and violent. So why is this? So when we talk about sex, we use words like bang, rail, now, pound, hit that, boink, screw, tap that, smash. Why do we use that kind of language? When we're talking about heterosexual relationships specifically, we tend to use these terms to describe something that's happening to women done by men. Why do we talk this way? And some of this is part of our gendered pattern of understanding. The language that we use to describe sex may also cue us into how we perceive this particular situation that we're in. So if we talk like these terms that I put here on the PowerPoint slide, it seems like it might be more casual, but if we use more emotional terms like we're making love as opposed to screwing, that might indicate that the situation is more meaningful or more emotional. So there is some method to how we talk about sex, and I encourage you to kind of think about that and talk about that with your friends. So rites of passage. This is where we're going to talk a little bit about virginity. We tend to take virginity pretty seriously in our culture. We describe virginity as something that we take, as something that we give. Virginity is something we save or something we preserve. We often treat the loss of virginity as somewhat of a marker of maturation or a rite of passage. So think in terms of those teen movies where people make the goal to lose their virginity by prom, something like American Pie. People who remain virgins later in life, either by choice, which is totally fine, or by circumstances, also totally fine, unfortunately often experience ridicule and shaming for not meeting this supposed cultural milestone. So they might be called terrible names like a fag or a prude or something like that just because they haven't had sex. Like if a man hasn't had sex by the time he's, I don't know, 25, or hasn't had sex with a woman, I should say, other people might assume that, oh, he must be gay. Or if a woman decides that she would like to save her virginity for marriage, totally fine, she might be called a prude. So they're often shamed and ridiculed, unfortunately. We tend to associate virginity with personal value, and this can really cause serious problems. So people who are still virgins by choice or by circumstance are still on the same path to maturity. Just because a person isn't a virgin doesn't mean that they're more mature. Obviously, I'm sure you know that. So it's important to remember that people may be virgins for a variety of reasons, and that's totally okay. And that we need to be respectful of other people's circumstances and choices. So next I'm going to start talking about a few issues that we are really looking at in terms of sociology. What are some broader areas of expansion? Again, I wish I could spend more class time on this. I could do a class period on just these three topics individually. So I'm just going to give you a basic overview of these and kind of what they're looking like and what the current trends and patterns are in studying them. So the first topic is street harassment. Street harassment is a really big topic of interest in research in sociology. Street harassment happens when a person, typically a woman, but not always, is faced with unwanted gestures, comments, or actions when they're just walking outside or engaging in public. This harassment often continues when the person asks the offender to stop their behavior, either verbally or they may attempt to signal discomfort through other means, meaning they might try to put their headphones on or in. They might try to make a phone call, avoid making eye contact. They might walk away faster or away just totally. Unfortunately, some people are actually really hurt or even killed when they reject street harassment advancements. I have linked a story about a unfortunate incident where a woman was murdered after she rejected a street harasser in the lecture notes. So feel free to take a look at that if you would like to see an example of what can happen. And it's always wrong to assume that people, particularly women, are always open to flirtation and that they want compliments. We need to be very careful and thoughtful about how we express our interest in other people. We always need to make sure that we're maintaining respect and that we're stopping if somebody asks us to stop. We need to be able to take a hint. Um, when people experience street harassment regularly, it can really make them feel pretty unsafe and uncomfortable with being out. So they may choose not to go out at all, or they may not feel like they can go out without somebody else with them. So it can really have detrimental effects on the day-to-day life of people who experience this on a regular basis and whose wishes have been repeatedly rejected. So if you see somebody who's being harassed on the street and you do feel safe doing so, you might walk up to them and tell them that you see what's happening to them and ask if they'd like you to take a walk with them for a few blocks. So there is a way to address this without being a bystander, but it's always important to put your own safety first and to respect the victim's wishes. So non-consensual pornography. This is another really big topic that we're looking at in sociology and criminology. So with the advancement of new technologies, there's new ways for people seeking to harm other people to do so. So it's basically we're using new tools for old purposes. So bullying's been around forever, but now we've got technology to facilitate new ways of doing it. Non-consensual pornography is often called revenge porn in the media. It's a trendy buzzword, but it's a little bit too simplistic to describe the phenomenon as a whole. So non-consensual pornography happens when one person shares sexual or nude images with other people without the consent of the person who is in the photo. This tends to happen a lot with sexting. The only person to blame is the person who shares the photos without consent. So it's not the person's fault for taking the photo. It's always the person who shares the photo without consent. It's on them. It's their blame. Many people don't even know that they've been victimized or that their photo has been shared. So by the time somebody finds out that their photo has been shared, it could have reached 20 people or 200 people. This type of victimization might negatively impact a victim's ability to get or keep a job if a boss sees these images or it hits the news or something like that. It might affect their ability to stay in school, especially in high schools. That travels really fast, so they might face some bullying or outcast. And it also might affect their ability to find new romantic partners. They might be ashamed to admit what's happened to them or to admit that their photo has been shared non-consensually and is out there. So it might prevent them from seeking relationships. These images often end up on pornography websites where strangers see them too, and this is very degrading and traumatizing for victims. To be clear, non-consensual pornography, aka revenge porn, is not the same as regular pornography. Men and women who participate in pornography consensually have agreed to being filmed and to having their images shared. Anything else that has not been agreed upon is absolutely a crime. And men and women who work in the porn industry may have their images shared or acts filmed that they don't agree to. And just because they are involved in porn doesn't mean that they can't have this crime committed against them. So anytime that this is shared non-consensually, it is a crime regardless of the circumstance or occupation that that person is in. Sharing a person's nude or sexual photos without their permissions, again, is a crime, so don't ever do it. Don't do it for props, don't do it as a joke, and don't do it for revenge. Otherwise, you're really going to risk facing some pretty serious charges and risk humiliating a victim, as they can't really escape it. I mean, once you put it online, it's just there. So they have very little recourse, especially if a person who offends against them has shared their image from England while they're living here. Police can't really do anything due to jurisdictional issues. So it's a very complicated topic, and the criminal justice system is not equipped at this point to deal with it. So another big issue in sociology is consent and working against sexual violence. So what is consent? When's it needed? Consent is another pretty trendy buzzword topic, but what does it actually mean? Sometimes it's assumed that people know what consent is, but maybe we should knock it out a little bit. So consent at its core is a voluntary and clear agreement between two fully conscious people to engage in sexual activity. Consent is required before any sex act. So if somebody doesn't consent at any point during the sexual encounter, it's a crime. Consent must be given throughout a sexual encounter, so don't assume all sexual acts are okay just because they agreed to the first. We need to make sure that we're seeking consent and that the other person is comfortable at every step of the way. Um, we need to make sure that consent is given every single time, even if you've done it before, even if you've done it with a person before. That doesn't mean that they want to do it with you again. Even if you did a funky sex thing before, doesn't mean that they liked it and want to do it again. So it's important that we're always asking. We should never make assumptions and should always get consent every single time. Consent needs to be given verbally, so we need to hear it from their mouth that they're okay what's going on. If they can't answer yes emphatically, it's not okay. If they're unconscious or incapacitated, it's not okay. And also importantly, natural body responses to sexual stimulation. This includes wetness and erection. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's conscious agreement or interest. So your body could literally be saying yes, but your mind is saying no. So you need to be sure that you are hearing that they have consented and that you're hearing that from them verbally. So sometimes the body has natural reactions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they want internally. So we always need to be sure that we're asking for consent throughout the sexual encounter, asking for consent every time we have sex with a person, or if we're trying to change things up, or with every sexual act we do. And we need to make sure that consent is being given verbally. So with that, that's going to end our section on gender and sexuality. Again, this is such a big topic. Obviously, we have entire classes to cover both issues. So if you are interested in either gender or sexuality, I do encourage you to take a look to see if we are offering any gender courses. We do have a gender and sexualities minor available. You might be able to major in it here, I'm not sure, but I do encourage you to check this out if this is a topic that you're interested in. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to talking about race next week.